This is the RAD panel. I'm going to have my panelists introduce themselves. So, Nick?
My name's Nick Hain from Novogradac and Company. I have 15 years of LIHTC and LIHTC program experience and working with housing authorities. And I've been working on about 15 RAD transactions to date.
Hi, welcome everyone. Mark Ragsdale with PNC Real Estate, a agency lender in the affordable housing space based out of San Francisco. Worked on several RAD transactions, a RAD 2 transaction, both pure 9% and 4% transactions as well with those, and looking forward to this panel. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kat Vielma. I'm the Vice President of Public Housing at the National Equity Fund. We are a nonprofit syndicator of tax credits. Lots of experience in RAD, I would argue for myself, given that about 6 months ago I worked within HUD, and I was a branch chief in charge of half of the RAD 1 portfolio, including the great state of Texas. So really, or I guess I should say Texas. So really excited to be here and hopefully make more bad jokes as the afternoon continues.
My name's Jeff Weiss. I'm the president of Alden Capital Partners. We are a tax credit syndicator. Kat really ruins my talk because she clearly can say she has more experience with RAD than anyone. But I like to say on the syndication side, our firm has more experience than other syndication firm. We've done a number of RAD deals throughout the country, done most of, I think, those 15 deals that Nick was talking about, and I've had the pleasure to do RAD transactions with everyone up here on the table, but for Mark. So really looking forward to this panel, and hopefully we can explain the magic of RAD.
And I'm Barry Palmer with the Coates Rose Law Firm, and we represent developers and a lot of housing authorities, and we've been working in the RAD program for a few years now and have worked on closing a number of RAD transactions that have closed here in Texas. So we're going to use a kind of a conversational style format here today as opposed to presentations or PowerPoints. And I'm just going to throw out some topics or questions for the panelists to talk about. And now that we're a few years into RAD, now that we've had some experience, what are some of the lessons that have been learned on transactions that have closed over the last couple of years?
So I'm gonna. We're all like looking to like the shootout at the OK Corral. So I guess it has been a few years since the program started. Technically, I would still argue that just about every 6 months it changes just a little bit. So I kind of feel like every 6 months it's a little bit of a different program than when I left it. I do think something I think we can all agree with very strongly is that development team matters. I'm not just talking about your management side or your co-general partner, but your lender, your syndicators, making sure that everyone knows RAD as much as they can at that given moment. Again, given that it's a demonstration and a constantly changing program. I'd also say patience is something I think we all agree goes alongside RAD very well. If you think it's going to take X days, make it 1.2 times X days because it's, conservatively. Because it's, again, a changing program. HUD's doing the very best. I know yesterday we had Tom Davis and a few other folks here on this same stage, I think. And so they're really working very hard. But just be patient, plan for more time than you think, and know that experience is worth its weight in gold.
On the experience and patience side, planning, I would say also, is you got to plan ahead. There were a number of housing authorities that were very ambitious, went out and applied under the initial 60,000 unit allocation, got a whole bunch of deals, and then they tried to figure out how to get it done instead of planning in advance. So the planning is thinking about what you're doing, assembling your team, getting everything together before you get your allocation of credits, getting everything together before you start thinking about a closing. There are a number of aspects that we'll get into later where there's some conflicts, and you have to think everything through before you start.
For me, it's it's an interesting path. I feel like early on nobody knew anything, and there was not much guidance from HUD. There wasn't much guidance from what the investors maybe were looking for. And I'm speaking from a accounting CPA, doing cost certs and 10%, looking at these housing authorities and they themselves trying to figure out what the best way for them to go. And I think we collectively have figured that out now. In real time, I can talk to these housing authorities and it's like, let's combo it with LIHTC, let's do a 4% deal. Let me back up for a second. The cap right now is at like 185,000. They're going to push it up to 250, I believe. Of that, only 30,000 has closed about. And of the 30,000, they kind of fall into 3 buckets. The 3 buckets are subsidy swap, going to 4% route, and going to 9% route. So these housing authorities, they're looking at it, what works best for them, and based on their size and all that. So early on, nobody knew what was best for them, and there was not a lot of guidance on that. Now we can figure out the older assets, ones that are built in the late 30s, early 40s and 50s. I'm looking for the word. They are functionally obsolete, where it's a 4-bedroom, 1-bathroom situation. Well, those
900 square feet.
Yeah, 900 square feet. So you're looking to tear those down, most likely. So what makes sense with those is maybe a 9% combo with RAD. Now, the ones in the 60s, 70s, they just need major rehab, and you're looking to leverage more money in. You're going to, and Jeff will, I don't want to steal his thunder on this area because I know he's very passionate about the 4%. There's something that makes sense for that with major rehabs, but not tear downs per se completely. And then the subsidy swap, that's just, different people will give your opinion on this, but housing authorities that have been short on the exchange from the proration from their capital funds and their operating subsidies, the frustration with that, managing their own budget. There's a lot of folks that feel switching over from Section 9 to Section 8, it's just less pain. So you have that. But now I feel like it's very easy to talk to housing authorities and guide them. There's a lot of deals out there that we can turn to and look at. So what started out really hard is really easy, I feel like, at this point, which is good.
Well, I'm on the planning bandwagon myself. These are complicated transactions, not, to some of us who do tax credit deals and financing and equity and redevelopment and as a daily chore or job or whatever. You can take a snapshot and look at the RAD process as just a simple development process or substantial rehabilitation or replacement housing. Doesn't actually, it's something we do every day. I think one of the lessons that I have is that it's not something housing authorities do every day. And so there is there has to be an acknowledgement within the housing authority that the task they're taking on is something different. And taking on something different doesn't mean it has to be difficult or hard or whatever, but there is a trust level that is involved in working with your partners, whether it's your lender or your equity provider or your contractor or your development. Maybe you have a developer partner where that has to get used to. That's one thing that I've noticed that can slow a project down is trying to look almost too much into it. And the second thing I have is planning with purpose. I know we talked about planning. I call it planning with purpose. What can really slow a RAD low-income housing tax credit redevelopment down is the changes of what you want that end result to be, whether it's the scope of work on your rehabilitation or whether you should have after all, decided to tear down that building rather than substantially rehabilitate it. And a lot of that, to me, has to do with kind of having the end in mind. And I think that when Jeff talked about like really planning and really thinking, I think it's good to almost start with, well, what do we want to have when we're done? And making sure that every time you pick up, project number 2 or project number 3 or project number 4, as you convert your RAD portfolio, you're working through it, is that you have you keep track of that end goal in mind of what you're going to look like when you're done and what it's going to be, because that will help you eliminate some of the noise that you think needs to be involved in the transaction in order to make a decision. And so that, what I mean by planning with a purpose, is really having sort of that end in mind where you want to end up, because you're as a housing authority, or if you're a developer working with a housing authority, you're going to have to work inside a public body that has a board, that has people they have to respond to, and you need to be able to keep the process on a line or on a track in order to accomplish your goal in the time frames that you want.
I think that I'll be very quick. I think the one thing I'll just add to that, and planning is very crucial. One of the things I've learned since I've left HUD, I know there are housing authorities with us from now, is that it's in addition to planning about what you want and what product you want in terms of the physical building. If you're a housing agency, the question is, who do you want to be after RAD happens, right? So if you're changing all of your public housing units through RAD to Section 8, what are you? You're not a public housing owner. Are you a developer? Do you want to be a property manager? Like what focus best meets the needs and the capacity of your team? And I'll tell you, we're all deal junkies here. I feel very confident in making that statement. But it really is a broader thought that I think a lot of development side, and really need to think more about who we are afterwards.
And I was going to echo one thing off of that. Early on, the first question I always would get from the housing authorities would be, I don't know if there's anybody that's completely new to this RAD concept, but Section 9 to Section 8, Section 9, these housing authorities don't own the assets. They can't put debt on these properties. So when they convert to the Section 8, you can now get debt. You can put these assets in a partnership and combo them with the low-income housing tax credit program, and that's very important. Now, when I use the word, the partnership can own that, kind of made me think about this was, well, these housing authorities are like, well, I just got this asset from HUD, and now I'm going to give 99% of it to the investors. Their concern is our mission is, just filling up the units with affordable housing, and they're like, well, if I do that, I'm not going to get the asset back. And that's, Barry and their team, Coates Rose, they will write agreements and put in a spot where there's a great comfort to these board of directors that show that, look, after 15 years, you're going to have the opportunity to take over that asset again. So I think the style to that presentation at these boards, because they don't know a lot about RAD and all the implications, but they do know that they're kind of losing the asset, it almost seems like, for a period of time, or it's perceived that they're losing it or losing control, and they don't want to do that. So showing that they're in the deal, there's control, and how it's legally run is important. And I think that's come a long way too.
So even though I'm the moderator, I get to answer my own question. So I've learned a few kind of practical things operating mostly in the state of Texas. And one thing, it's very hard to get 9% credits for RAD deals. There have been a handful that have done it, but it's hard to get 9% credits. And even once you do get 9% credits, then you have all the deadlines that go along with 9% credits that can sometimes be problematic for your RAD transaction. So the easier execution from my side is a 4% deal. which works really well on acquisition rehab, and Jeff will get into some more on acquisition credits and why that works so well financially on the 4% side. But it can be a real challenge to make a new construction deal work with 4% credits. And you've got, I see Will here in the audience. I know he's done it, but it's not easy to do, to make new construction work with just 4% credits. And the other thing that we've learned over the last couple of years is just how instrumental the historic tax credit can be, and how that is something that you really should look at if you're doing rehab in the state of Texas, at least, because Texas now has its own state historic tax credit, whereas the federal credit was only 20% and may not be worth the trouble to go through all the brain damage of doing a historic deal. If you put the 25% state tax credit on top of it, and now you've got 45% of historic tax credits on top of a 4% LIHTC credit, it starts to look a lot more like a 9% deal. So that's something that we've learned along the way, is how well those can work together, at least in Texas. And then another thing that we've come to know is that working in RAD and combining it with LIHTC in Texas, the rules are not always, and procedures don't always work that well together, and some of the TDHCA's rules and guidelines don't work that well for RAD issues, and some of HUD's requirements, like, for example, in order for them to issue the RCC, they want you to have your tax credit allocation. Well, in Texas, if you're doing a 4% credit deal, you're not going to get your tax credit allocation until right before closing. So you need to kind of work through with HUD and TDHCA the things that don't work well in their various programs. So, but with that, I guess another thing to talk about is we've been in this program for a few years now, and about 35,000 units have closed, which is a lot less than the 165 that are allocated. And so what are some of the issues that you've seen housing authorities run into as to why deals sometimes struggle to get to closing?
I'm just going to keep doing it because we do this like moment.
Right.
Of,
no, you always
dancing.
go first.
Okay.
That's the rule.
Okay. Thank you. It's very kind. So I think I know the program is a couple years old, and I feel like that's a long time, but I also recognize that really it's a drop in the bucket of the HUD world, in the sense that this is still a very new program for HUD, very new program for every housing finance agency, and I agree with Barry, kind of like dovetailing right back in. I think housing finance agencies across the country are still learning RAD. And that tends to be an issue whether you're in Georgia, whether you're in Maryland, or you're within Texas. Your team has to educate everyone else, whether it's a housing finance agency or their council. You're educating yourself and those around you, and that makes it very difficult to get to a nice, smooth closing when we imagine everyone knows what they're doing and birds are chirping. It's a great day. We're going to close. That's just difficult to do with PNRAD. I'd also say, this has just been tattooed to the back of my head because of my time at HUD, but survey and title continues to be a nightmare, especially as it relates to the declaration of trust that's placed on these properties. So just a little HUD lingo for y'all. The declaration of trust, or the DOT, is a legal document that HUD signs when they built the public housing unit in the 1930s or 40s or 50s, saying this property is a public housing asset. HUD is the sole owner. The PHA will operate it, so on and so forth. All the legal language, much nicer than that. And HUD and the Inspector General have found that not all public housing properties had DOTs. And so, we're unraveling, and I keep saying we like I'm at HUD. They are unraveling a lot of these legal issues that, they didn't get to in the 30s or 40s. They were telegramming someone or something. And so it's, you're unraveling a lot of the cobwebs of things that happened in the 30s, survey title, the DOT. And then, of course, when you jump back to today, you're dealing with outside parties that are still learning RAD. So I think, to me, those are the two biggest issues that I just see in every single deal. And I'm sure Jeff and others might have other things to add.
Well, I have something to kind of add. You're talking about not all of the deals had DOTs recorded. One of the things I kind of find funny, actually there's a lot of things I find funny, especially with RAD, but is flood zones. We have a number of properties, public housing properties, that are in flood zones. But RAD prohibits you from having a deal participate in RAD that's in a flood zone. So we have public housing in flood zones that you can't revitalize. And there was a statistic that I had that I wanted to say. The 1.2 million units of public housing in the country, here I got it right here, HUD came out and said of the 1.2 million public housing units, they need $26 billion worth of capital needs. Okay, so if I can't rehabilitate the deals in flood zones, what are you just writing those off? I mean, what's going on there? So there's a number of things within HUD. Forget HUD and the housing authorities, or HUD and the state finance agencies. HUD itself has their own conflicts that you have to be aware of and work through.
Absolutely.
That's right. I can even add to that. I know that yesterday it was even brought up about HUD having its own internal conflicts about vouchers on elderly projects and Section 8 and RAD 2 transactions where you're bringing in project-based vouchers, and how HUD has admitted they've got one silo that thinks legally one way, and HUD admits they have one silo that thinks legally another way. They've at least acknowledged that they have two different schools of thought on that. And they're working on
that's
it.
A big step.
I think what they said is
Admitting
they're working.
the problem is the first step.
Admitting the problem is the first step, exactly. But I would say one of the things that can really trip up a process is procurement processes that have been put in place within the each particular housing authority. And I wish I could tell you that there was a standard handbook for a procurement process that all housing authorities across the United States subscribe to, but that does not exist. Everybody has their own procurement process and their own rules and their own ways. And as we get into processes of transactions, and we try and, if you want to, for lack of a better phrase, conform a transaction to what we would call a low-income housing tax credit development model, we need things like a general contractor. It seems simple, but it's hard to procure a general contractor on a timely basis all the time. And you may have already done your PCNAs, and you may already have come up with an entire development plan or redevelopment plan for a property, and then the lender or the equity provider might ask an important question like, okay, so has your general contractor bid this yet? And the answer sometimes we'll get is, we don't have a general contractor yet. So that's a problem, right? Because, we're still in the procurement process for that. So timing out your procurement process and paying attention, even for those consultants that are working with housing authorities who are pushing this through, or lenders or everybody, you need to pay attention to the procurement process and make sure that they're getting all of their team to the table at the same time, so that contractors are in place, so that we can get the data and the process can move on whatever development timeline that you've put together, so that you can meet not just your HUD RAD deadlines, but sort of your low-income housing tax credit allocation deadlines. Even if for 4% deals you can get allocated, you still have deadlines to get closed. So you need to pay attention to those things.
For me, the closing challenges are more accounting tax related, and the two that come to mind for me is the ground lease agreements and the credit delivery schedule. With the ground lease, and I'm talking about when we combo it with low-income housing tax credits. When a ground lease is involved, if we have to figure out if it's going to be a capital lease or an operating lease, and there's eligible basis issues to that on credit delivery, or the amount of credits. And then with the credit delivery schedule itself, getting the investor in the deal, that's sometimes interesting, especially with the ACC rehab deals, the 4%, because depending if it's light rehab or heavy rehab, are the tenants that are there, are they above the income limits under the one program versus the LIHTC? So there needs to be a lot known prior to closing for the credits in some cases. So having those discussions and having the syndicators due diligence in there early to get their comfort of what they're working with is important.
You know, Barry, Nick just kind of hit on, you know, the income issue. Maybe talk about that for a second.
Right.
One of the biggest conflicts in RAD, with RAD and LIHTC, has to do with the income qualification. Under RAD, every resident has the right to return to their property regardless of their income level. Okay, as long as they qualified for public housing, 80% of AMI or less at the time they moved in, it doesn't matter what their income is today, unless it's a right to work, but we'll push that to the side. They have the right to return. They can live in public housing forever, regardless of what their income level is. Okay, so now under RAD, or now LIHTC, because most RAD deals, I think just over a majority, of the RAD deals have been done with tax credits, and 83% of the LIHTC deals have been rehab deals. So there's your little statistics. That was in a HUD newsletter in January. So you have this right to return, whether it's rehab or whether it is new construction, they get to return to that site. And that's a direct conflict with 60% or less AMI. So you need to go and figure out your residents. And by the way, you can't encourage them to move. Can't give them TVs or things like that. You get in trouble, okay? Doesn't matter if HUD might have approved you doing that, you still get in trouble after the fact. So you have to deal with your residents, and you have to plan on them returning. Because there's no way for you to get them not to come back. So when you look at the property, you have to go through the income rolls and try to pre-qualify every resident. Otherwise, you're going to have units that never comply. So do you go in and get an allocation that says I'm going to be a 90% affordable, or do you go in for 100% affordable? Income qualifying your tenants before you do the tax credit application probably isn't going to happen. Would that be a best practice? Yeah, it would. But it's probably not going to happen. You get your allocation, then you start qualifying residents. And you're going to have to make a decision and talk to your syndicator and your investor and your state agency of how you're going to deal with this. Do you, as I said, apply for 90% affordable, or do you go for the whole 100% affordable and just deal with the fact that you're going to have some residents that are over income and those units won't qualify for credits? If you talk to your syndicator and your investor up front, they plan for that, they're okay. But you have to acknowledge you're going to get an 8823 because you're out of compliance. Now, hey, no big deal, you weren't claiming the credits, who cares? But you need to plan on that affordability, and that is probably one of the biggest conflicts between RAD and LIHTC.
And to take that one step further even, some of that planning strategically is important because, for example, if you have a fourplex, a lot of these housing authorities have a lot of scattered sites, and when you're grouping certain projects together, if you never meet your minimum set aside, you get no credits ever on some of those units. So, you know, you may have three, in a fourplex, I'm thinking, you may have three of those units be between the 60 and 80%, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in 5 years if they become under the 60%. You can never get credits on that building, that deal. You
have to be creative in designating what your buildings are. You know, you can get a bin on an individual building or the project, but through a large deal that all of us but Mark did together here, we did some research where we found out that you were able to designate a group of buildings to get a bin. A little bit contrary to the normal belief of a building's a bin or a project. So you have to plan that into the equation when you're looking at qualifying your tenants.
So, Mark, can you give us the lender's perspective on looking at RAD transactions as to some of the specific requirements that you're looking at when you're underwriting a RAD loan transaction?
Sure. So there's two kinds of RAD transactions. There's RAD 1, RAD 2, really, that are out there. The only one I'm going to talk about, I did a RAD 2 transaction. It's a little interesting. I know that we haven't talked about that a lot, but that's where you can bring some project-based vouchers into the project and they can assign it. And one of the interesting things that came up there that for people to be aware of is that you're using project-based vouchers, and project-based vouchers are not markup to market. These are not, they're not that type of a Section 8, and people should be aware of that, so that you're going to have limits at the FMR, 110% of the FMR, and they can't really exceed that unless they're willing to spread that across their entire portfolio and have a budget for that, and that ends up reducing their total overall capabilities of producing vouchers. So for housing authorities who are trying to budget and everything, they're generally not going to do that, and you need to account for that from a finance standpoint. From an underwriting standpoint, we're generally underwriting a Section 8. People need to be aware that from an underwriting standpoint, what's different about this than what people hear about in a lot of typical sort of markup to market transactions and things like that is that this Section 8 is set based on the operating subsidies that were provided to the property previously. So you're not basing this on market rents. You're not basing this on really anything that has to do with what's going on with the outside world. It's purely an independent, in its own bubble, if you want to call it, scenario, property by property. And so that subsidy comes in, that rent gets set, and then you've got to make a determination. One of the things that as lenders that we have to do always, and equity providers too, but right, we're coming up with NOI. So the second part of that equation, so now you've got this sort of income side that's in its own little bubble. The second part of that equation is you've got this whole expense equation, often under an operating model where you operated your entire portfolio essentially as a corporation with all these incomes coming in, and you had a single balance sheet and a single operating statement. You now have to break that down and be able to come to the table and say, oh, well, this particular property is costing us, $4,200 a unit a year to operate. Is it or isn't it? Now, as lenders, we have to prove that on a situation where we really don't have any historical capability of proving that other than to look at our portfolios. I mean, most of us up here work for large companies, and we all have pretty massive databases that we can reach into, and we will do that to look at what we think what our expectations should be for how a property should operate in that, and then we have to combine that with other aspects that may come in the deal. So those are some of the things from an underwriting standpoint as a lender that you really have to be, that we really have to delve into, because that sets the bar, if you want to call it, for how your debt's going to be put together. And it's not consistent because part of the issue, and I know that you talked about this earlier, where you said, you've got an operating model where you've operated as this company that's received this big subsidy. Now all of a sudden you're turning that into individual property operations. And so getting the information from the staff and getting the right information and being able to put that together, I mean, talk about planning and everything that we've talked about. This is also one of the aspects that has to be dealt with and planned for, and from a timing standpoint, be folded into this overall processing timeline you're putting together.
Well, you're talking about the Section 8 rent, which is very interesting, because this is a situation where the inefficient housing authority is rewarded. Because the inefficient housing authority, basically under public housing, they have the total operating budget from the CEO to the grounds worker on individual property is all put together. This is our expenses divided by units, right, and then they go to HUD. That's what we need. So that is how the money under public housing is sent out. So we get now Section 8 kind of based on the same calculation. So they have the same revenue. So if you were an efficient housing authority where you were really managing your overhead, you're probably not going to get any pickup here with your Section 8. Right. However, if you're an inefficient housing authority, you're now going to be able to support debt, and maybe a lot of debt on your property, because you're going to have that higher subsidy.
And I think one thing I do want to mention for some of the people who like reading legal documents at night, the RAD statute has what HUD calls shall language. So at the end of the initial term of the HAP contract, secretary shall offer and the owner shall take the renewal of that HAP contract. So I know that Freddie, Fannie, and the FHA mortgage system all underwrite to the complete term of their mortgage using that HAP. So in previous deals, whenever it is a non-RAD HAP. If you have a 221D program that is a 40-year mortgage loan, FHA will underwrite the first 20 years under the HAP, and then the second 20 will be based on market rents, because there's no provision that says that HAP contract will be renewed again. But because of RAD, those two magical words, shall, is allowing lenders, and if I don't know if Mark wants to expand, but to be able to fully underwrite to the 40-year mortgage or 30-year mortgage, whatever. And that is such a huge help. And so I think that's a really important part, both on the lending side and then also on the equity side too. And it's why I get comfortable so easily with RAD deals, and we don't clobber them with reserve requirements, because it's a shall, it's perpetuity. Now, of course, it's subject to Congress, but I'm personally hoping Congress appropriates money for federal programs, or else I don't know what we would do as a society. And I think it's a very safe bet to make. But I'm not sure if anyone else wants to comment on my two favorite words, the shall.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of provisions in there on the shall, and generally, maybe there's the unspoken trust, which is housing authorities are in the business of providing affordable housing, and the Section 8 is what makes their, under the new, paradigm of a RAD transaction, makes the property operate and run. And there's no reason to believe that in 15 years or 20 years, whatever the term of that contract ends up being before it comes up for renewal, that they wouldn't renew it. And there really is no incentive for them not to at this point. So, certainly the contract is a long enough term for us to underwrite an agency loan like a Freddie or a Fannie. That is in there. Kudos to Freddie Mac a little bit, because they were one of the first to the table, because I'm going to feed Barry here a little something to talk about, which is there is a regulatory agreement that comes with this transaction that's different than other regulatory agreements, and lenders had to understand that and get used to that from a legal standpoint. I know you've mentioned about legal documents and things, and not all lenders are all the way there. In terms of construction lenders and traditional market lenders. HUD, of course, is there because HUD felt like, I guess, we need to finance our own projects. Freddie Mac got there very early in the process in terms of understanding, but there is, language that limits some of the abilities as a lender to protect their investment as a loan that's contained within the regulatory agreement. And I think, that is an aspect that people have to do. So you talk about I think it's fair to say, just in general, that there is a trust that goes with this, but you are making loans generally to a housing authority or a development partner and a housing authority in combination on what was public housing, and you have to understand that effectively the program is designed to say that no matter what you call it or do to it or make it into a tax credit deal, it's still public housing, and you have to remember that at the end. And I don't know, you might want to talk about some of the regulatory agreement issues and stuff.
Yeah, well, not really.
No.
That's a little boring. What I would rather talk about.
Okay.
What I would rather talk about is something that I know Jeff and I both.
Since you are allowed to ask your own questions.
Yeah, I am the moderator. What Jeff and I like to talk about is why it is that 4% acquisition rehab deals work so well. And the beauty of it is the acquisition credit. And so, Jeff, I know you've gone through this a few times, the free money concept.
Yeah, once or twice.
Yeah.
So everyone come close, the free money part's coming. So just
This is the free money part.
Under RAD, utilizing rehabilitation, there is an opportunity for free money. It's not, the dollar bills being handed out for free, but you're getting the opportunity to bring in tax credit equity that wouldn't be there otherwise. So basically, under RAD and a rehab transaction, HUD is releasing their DOT on the property, allowing the housing authority to sell the property to the project partnership. Now, the Housing Authority just got this property for free, so they own nothing on it. So they are going to sell it to the project partnership, and they're going to take back a note. No money just changed hands. However, you just created value. The improvements, there is value associated with the improvements. I'm going to talk in a moment about the little tweak on how you value that, but there is value in the improvements, and you can get acquisition credits on those. You sell the acquisition credits, you get equity. Right there, free money. The program that was set up right off the bat, you got money. There's a, I'm going to give a slight sales pitch. If you walk by our booth, there is a case study on the HACEP transaction that talks about this. But basically, that deal was $225 million total development costs. The acquisition credits created $25 million in equity. So out of nothing, right off the bat, we got $25 million out of the capital stack. You know, that was huge. There is, and also the note is then a receivable to the Housing Authority. So at the end of the day, if the project produces cash flow, the note gets paid off. The note produces losses. You still credits and losses, tax benefits, so it helps in your pricing. And truthfully, when they get to the right of first refusal or the option, they're usually owed money. Right. So that helps with them buying the limited partnership interest or buying the partnership, or the project, I'm sorry. The one item, though, that you have to be aware of in valuing properties is the most common way to value a multifamily property is a cap rate. You know, NOI divided by a cap rate. Well, public housing produces zero NOI. It's a break even or less. So how do you value something that's got zero value? So we spent a lot of time on how to theorize this, and a number of industry top professionals got involved. And we worked with HUD officials, we worked with HUD attorneys, and the theory was that the property, since HUD has the ability to allow you to take a property out of the program. Forget RAD for a second. There is a process you can go through where a property can be taken out of the program and sold to market.
Section 18 demo dispo.
There you go. So because there is this theory that a HUD property can actually now be rented at market rents, for 1 second, in this process, we value the property at market value, subject to its condition, of course, and things like that. Look at market rents at that property based on a market cap adjusted for the property's condition. That comes up, that is how you value this property. So generally, this value is much higher than you actually expected. And we originally, on our first couple deals, there were assumptions that there was a lower value because they were being valued at tax credit rents, okay, not at a market value. So that is, right there kind of spells out why I think rehabs are really the best way to go, because of that funding source. And if you can do a 9% rehab, it's a home run.
Right. And I'll say I think this has become an industry standard. That's why we see the huge number of RAD deals that are using the 4% credit model, because it's 15% of your capital stack just appears. And I also think, personally, it's why you see RAD working really well on the coasts and why it's a struggle within the plains. So I think that's HUD's next problem is, so this works in New York City really great to the tune of $1 billion with the NYCHA that just announced a couple weeks prior. Works great in San Francisco, works great in El Paso. What about Omaha? What about Boise? What about Denver? And so that's my concern is when you have the acquisition value, maybe Denver's not a good place to lump that in, but where the acquisition value, you know, even with those market rates doesn't help you, that's my concern. That's where I hope we as an industry start moving towards, is figuring out how we solve that next problem. Because if we can, you know, recapitalize half of the public housing stock to $13 billion worth, that still leaves $12 billion of capital needs in public housing, and people that are living in what seems like third world status across the country. So sorry, that's like my next personal mission is how to solve the Omaha problem. Yeah. So if anyone has any suggestions, I'll be around.
You know, unfortunately, I think there are certain markets that RAD just doesn't work in.
I agree.
I mean, in certain markets, it just doesn't work, and that's a shame. because I really do believe, in the beginning I don't think we were naysayers, but we pointed out some negatives. I am a true supporter and proponent of RAD. I think it's the future of public housing. I think it's the right decision. It allows the public housing agencies to evolve and to continue and accomplish a number of different missions. It brings private sector support into an area that traditionally has been just government-based. The low-income housing tax credit program is the most successful public-private partnership, period. It enjoys support from both sides of the aisles. Imagine if a HUD program could fit into that. Right now, you go to Congress, people hate HUD or they love HUD. There's nowhere in between. But under this program, I think it will bring public housing to an area where public housing and HUD will enjoy support from both sides of the aisle.
I agree.
I was going to make one comment off of the 4% over the subsidy swaps. Subsidy swaps were happening quite a bit, and now HUD has kind of reprioritized move up the 4%, 9% as they come through, and kind of backburn some of the subsidy swaps. So another incentive.
Yeah, that was in the brand new notice where they put different tiers of HUD will close you faster, or HUD will issue your CHAP faster if you're demo and building new, if you're using the 9% credit model, 4% credit model, ... and if you're just changing the subsidy from Section 9 to Section 8. So that kind of was very clear about what HUD likes and what HUD doesn't like. So it'll be interesting to see what that happens as the cap gets lifted next.
Yeah, I think that we'll see more and more transactions done in combination with tax credits, and particularly with the 4% credit. I hadn't heard that number of 83% of them being 4%, but it makes a lot of sense to me for a couple of reasons. One is it's so hard to get 9% credits. And then the other thing is, we talk about the acquisition credit. Well, you're only going to get the acquisition credit if you're going to do rehab. If you tear down and build new construction, not only is it more costly, but you just lost the acquisition credit. So that makes it much more of a struggle to do new construction, the combination of those two.
Well, and I think it goes back to what Jeff said when you talk about acquisition rehab versus new construction, and you're going to have situations where something's just not worth saving, so you're going to do a new construction because it's just too much. But generally, if you can get away with the acquisition rehab model, first of all, you get the acquisition credits as opposed to going to the land basis, which is not as advantageous. But it's also goes back to what we started with in this conversation where we talked about planning. When you're working on a RAD transaction, you're going to find that there are a lot of people on the call. It's sort of like doing a bond call from day one. All of a sudden, there's 40 people on the phone. You're like, wow, welcome everybody.
90% attorneys, right?
And, there are a few attorneys, maybe not 90, 50, but anyway.
I like when I call in and they say, you're the 34th person joining the call.
Exactly. And you're thinking, this is the kickoff call. Wow, we got a long way to go. There'll be 150 on here when we're done. Anyway, and so new construction involves just even that many more people and that many more that you have to bring to the table, and all of a sudden might involve rezoning of your property with the city, or all of a sudden, you're dealing with a different set of codes that you might not have to respond to in a substantial rehab versus new construction, and you have to understand those, and that goes into your model, and how long is it going to take you at the Housing Authority to figure that out and put that all together. So it's also, part of what's happening is that we have this nice RAD subsidy coming in and this ability to create free money. We also have low interest rates, and we also have very high tax credit pricing. So for those places that are struggling a bit because their Section 8 isn't high, either because they were a highly efficient housing authority or they happen to be in a smaller market, and I know Texas has a lot of housing authorities in a lot of smaller markets, and so one way to combat that, of course, is to move and take advantage of where we are today in this environment, because it's not likely to get much better than this now in terms of what you're going to be able to get with the transition to the Section 8 model and pursuing this low-income housing tax credit. So sort of a time is of the essence speech there, but really I kind of feel like that's part of the solution for some of these smaller market or lower income market areas.
Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about some issues that we see coming up on RAD transactions, combining RAD with the LIHTC that maybe are different in some regard than your typical LIHTC transaction. And I'd like to throw out one that has been extremely critical to the housing authorities that we've represented, and that is the exit strategy on these deals. As Jeff mentioned earlier, the housing authority is putting in their properties into these deals, and so they want to be 100% sure that they're going to get the property back. But in the typical tax credit paradigm with an investor and a developer, the tax credit investors partnership agreement, will have things that, like a forced sale. You may have a right of first refusal, but there'll be provisions if you were to be removed from as the general partner, that right of first refusal would go away. And those are fairly standard in the industry, and they work well when you're in a new construction tax credit transaction where the investor is putting in all the equity and all the developer is putting in is their guarantees and sweat equity, but they're not putting any money in. But it doesn't really work so well when you've got a housing authority that's putting in an asset worth millions of dollars, and all they're doing is taking a note back for it. And they have provisions with the investor, where they can conceivably get kicked out of the deal for any number of reasons and have their right of first refusal go away. So, we've had some long negotiations on that issue with our investor partners, and certainly Alden Torch has a lot of experience on that. I'm sure NEF does too. So maybe we can hear from the investors on their viewpoint on that issue.
In a lot of this stuff, Barry, we went through it, you and I, on this. I will not admit to ever saying this, even though I'm being tape recorded and videotaped.
I know.
Pause. Pause that. As a syndicator and investor, you have to take the position here, which, as I said, I'll never admit I said this, that you are here to help. You are here to be almost a lender. It's not your deal. For tax purposes, I got to make sure it looks like I own it. But at the end of the day, I understand that the housing authorities are going to get their property back. So you have to structure it that way. Rights of first refusal and options, generally, if you get removed as a GP, you lose your option, you lose your right of first refusal. What we've done with the RAD deals and our deals with housing authorities in general is we have made that both the option and right of first refusal survive a default and removal by the housing authority. This really is kind of in line with what HUD wants and some congressional intent. There were some Congress men and women who were making some hoopla. Yes, yeah. Sorry. Who were complaining about a transaction early on where they felt that the housing authority just gave it away.
Right.
So we don't want to do that. We want this program to continue. We want support to continue, and we want the housing authorities to continue. So right off the bat, you have to let that happen. Now, hey, we might have to bring a replacement GP in. So Barry and I negotiate the appropriate percentage of cash flow that may not go to their seller note to provide an incentive fee to the replacement GP. But the housing authorities must have the opportunity at the end of the day to get these properties back. That is our starting position and our finishing position in regards to those. Loss limitations, we're also starting to give housing authorities let their option, I know it's fair market value, but let their option start coming in right after the end of the credit period. So we're trying to do everything we can to allow the housing authority to get the property back at not a major cost.
So I think we all agree that the housing authority has a right to the property at the end of the compliance period. I think we all agree that some great lawyers that put some great language into great documents and to how that actually works. What I would argue, and again, this kind of speaks to the earliest point, development team matters, right? So, I'm sure if you looked at our legal documents, they're all fairly similar. Practice in terms of what everyone does is a little different, and so that's anytime I visit a public housing authority, I tell them when you're doing your request for proposals, don't just ask for proposals, ask for references. Find out other housing authorities that have dealt with this group, whether it's a lender or on the equity side, and see how they've dealt with the year 15 process. I think experience is super crucial, and we all have it. I think the mission of every person at the table is important. So NEF is a nonprofit owned by another non-for-profit. Will never really be sold or go away or vanish. We have a long-term mission to be part of this of this great work. And so I think references, development team experience, super crucial. And if a housing authority ever has a question about this process, I think that's the moment that you reach out to your friends at NARA or at CLAFA and say, look, this is my deal structure. Do you have a peer that I can call? And I've actually been surprised that I don't think that happens as much as I thought it did when I was within HUD. And now I'm finding out that really many housing authorities, not all, do operate in these kind of silos of, well, my deal is special and unique, but they don't learn best practices from the housing authority that's 20 miles north. So I think that's really crucial to the year 15 process as well.
Well, I'm only going to add that, as a lender, and our company does equity as well, so I'm involved in those phone calls and listen in. But really, mostly, I think that what eases the process, especially about what, how, Barry sort of brought about it, talked about it, right? And you look at the overall here, this is still public housing, and you can't forget that. At the same time, so that's looking at it from those of us who are used to doing low-income housing tax credit development deals and redevelopment deals and substantial rehab deals. We're like, we got a developer, we have to understand that this has to remain public housing. So that's, looking one direction. So we say, okay, we're going to have to change the OPA. We're going to have to make, we're going to have to adapt. Looking at it, it's also good to set the expectations, though, looking from the other direction. There are, the housing authorities are going to have consultants. The housing court, some housing authorities I've worked with, they have their own development divisions that are fantastic developer groups. They can build like as good as anybody. They can get it done. But at the same time, they have to understand they are now entering into a different world. So it's good to make sure that the conversation is being viewed from both directions. I mean, what I will tell you is, as much as the OPA, operating partnership agreement needs to be adjusted so that you can make an exit that works with the fact that at the end of the day, this is public housing and is going to stay public housing. You have to be able to get to the housing authority and talk to them and say, at the end of the day, the investor's going to exit. Somehow they're going to exit this transaction. And when they exit, they need to make sure their taxes are paid. And they need to make sure they exit appropriately, because that's what the investor's not in this for forever, and that's it. And that is the expectation needs to be set. So setting those expectations on sort of that broad level so that everyone understands, look, from our viewpoint, we're looking this direction. We need to understand that this is always going to be public housing. At the same time, the housing authorities need to look from their viewpoint back the other way and understand that, hey, this is an investor that's making a tax credit investment. They're looking for a yield, and at the end of the day, they're going to exit.
Yeah, I don't want to scare folks too much, but I will say that I've started to see and hear within the industry some of the early investors that were part of this community in the early to mid 90s have been staying a little longer than I think their welcome was meant to be, because the losses have been a very nice bonus to them. And again, that speaks to, I think, everything the three of us have said, which is look at your legal documents, have a really great team, be thoughtful, know that the street operates in those two different ways. And I think we all agree that we expect the investor to exit on a timely basis. But again, I've been hearing a lot more of, well, they're still sticking around here 17 or 18, the losses are good, so, and the housing authority doesn't know the leverage that they have in terms of using that, to exit or to get the investor to actually exit, then it becomes messy. Who knows what we're going to be talking about in 16 years? But I think that's something that we're starting to pick up now that deals were closed 15, 16, 17 years ago.
So what we have recommended doing with our housing authority clients is when you get to the stage of picking a tax credit investor, and we work on some transactions where the housing authority is doing it themselves, but in a lot of times they're partnering with a developer, and the developer and the housing authority will jointly come up with a process to pick the tax credit investor. And you don't have to do a RFP for tax credit investors, but we recommend that there be some kind of a competitive process that the developer and the housing authority go through to select an investor. And in this very competitive investor environment, we have, as part of the process of soliciting proposals, we've developed a couple of pages that outline the exit strategy that we ask to be included in the investor's letter of intent, and send that out with the solicitation for proposals. And we're finding that investors are pretty receptive to it, particularly when you get in at the stage where they haven't been picked yet. They're competing with other investors. And you're asking, is it okay if this is our exit strategy?
It's the first
and
date.
yeah, right. So, yeah, sure.
Barry, I'm always amenable to your comments.
Anyway, that just as a practical tip on how you can deal with these issues up front, so you don't get into your deal with your investor and you're already down the road and negotiating partnership agreements, and for the first time you're raising your exit strategy, and there's a lot of pushback from the investor council, and by then it's too late to change horses. So that's one thing that we've recommended. That
I've seen it a lot. It's in every RFP that I've been answering to. It's, please describe your exit taxes based on this deal modeling, and please describe your exit tax process, and please give us 3 names of housing authorities that you've exited with in the last 5 years. Those are the 3 best questions, and I see them pretty often.
Yeah, because when somebody says, well, you're going to get the property back just by assuming debt and paying the exit taxes, well, everybody thinks, well, that sounds like a good deal. But the exit taxes on these 4% deals can be a big number. So you should be having Novogradac or whoever run some numbers up front to do a calculation of what you think the exit taxes will be. That may not turn out to be the case, but at least you have an idea of what they could be and have some plan as to how you're going to pay them. Okay, so one thing I wanted to talk about was what we've been calling the new RAD notice, but now it's been out for a year now, so it's not that new, but I keep learning new things about it every day, so I'll keep calling it the new RAD notice until they issue another one. But Kat, what are some of your thoughts as to some of important things that were covered in the new RAD notice?
So I think everyone will say, well, I don't want to put words in people's mouths. I say most people would say that the most important thing in the brand new notice is the whole section as it relates to the fair housing process. So I know Tom sat here just yesterday and said, the process itself is not new. Our review process of those standards are different, which is an accurate statement. But again, it's this inclusion of that process. I actually don't think that's the craziest new thing within the notice. I think the inclusion of the McKinney SRO program within the notice kind of speaks to where I think HUD wants this program to start to move. So we're not just recapitalizing public housing, but also looking at a lot of other orphan, HUD programs that are in desperate need of private capital from folks like us to help them be operational and be able to continue serving that needy population. We also know that the president's budget, which was passed by the Senate but not the House, in addition to including the cap being raised from 185 to 250, also includes adding pracs And so I think that just speaks to this program really is growing. I know we all have a lot of lessons learned and things that are still stressful and difficult, but HUD is really feeling like this is the car that it just wants to keep going. And so I'm interested to see, you know, how this new old notice actually starts to move those brand new deals through the pipeline. And the third notice, which I think we'll be talking about at next year's TAP, hopefully includes Prax. So just a little look into my little crystal ball. So.
Anybody else with any comments on the RAD notice? Or another thing I wanted to get input from is some of the tax issues that we see on these transactions, some of the key tax issues that we've had to deal with. And, you know, Jeff, you've talked some about the, you know, acquisition credit and the appraisal issue, but there are, you know, some other things that we've had to deal with on the tax side, you know, on you know, seller notes and related party issues. So if anybody wants to talk about some of the tax issues that we've dealt with.
Can we do like a step forward? I'll do
Yeah,
these.
yeah. I know I know that Nick will.
Yeah, well, the first thought was, I think of it more, not the taxes as much as the eligible basis issues. A couple things that it's kind of current is, it's not in 4% deals, 9% deals. Many of your consultants here can tell you about relocation expenses, if you're going to include them. And since we're talking so much about the ACK rehab, the 4%, you may be moving these tenants out, and that relocation costs, are we going to include it in eligible basis and not? And why it became a hot topic is because of there was an audit technique guide that came out saying don't include these costs, and the IRS Treasury regs tell us, you know, we can include it. So you have conflicting information with that. So then you look at the state agency and what they're maybe willing to do with that. I feel like it's up to the CPAs to kind of determine that. But that's one of the main things with these ACK rehabs I'm seeing. The other thing, we talk about exit taxes. Exit taxes scare me on bond deals typically. Anybody that's done the Hope 6, it always comes to mind with the housing authorities that were involved back in 06, 07. Maintaining those capital accounts and those losses, because there's not much capital. Most of the deal is structured with bonds. So little equities in there, but you still have, so 30% equity may be in the deal, but 100% depreciation of the building costs may be coming to you as an investor. So I'm always scared on maintaining that for at least 10 years or seeing those losses. But with the Section 8 overhang income, and I see the cash flow potential, I'm comfortable getting past that tax credit process through year 10 easily. But it's still scary because bond deals, it's always an issue. It always comes up. You get past year 10, you're sitting in this period from you know, deferred maintenance again, and all of a sudden all these losses that are just being driven into the property as repair being deducted and not capitalized. All of a sudden you're sitting there with a negative capital account on an investor, and they're getting paid a pretty penny on that. So that's always a concern, but I think we're modeling a lot of it where it seems to be pretty good, like a 9% deal. We don't really hear about 9% deals having these exit tax, unless they're just a dog. But
in which case we wouldn't be working on them.
Yeah.
I know one tax issue that I get asked about by, you know, people looking at RAD transactions is the concept of selling the property to yourself and taking acquisition credits, and people think that you can't do that, that there's this related party rule that prohibits you from getting an acquisition credit if you sell the property to yourself. But the way that the IRS defines a related party is a lot different than, for example, the way that TDHCA defines identity of interest. So what happens is you make it so that you're not a related party. So to be a related party, you have to have 50% or more of either ownership or financial interest or benefits. And of course, on the seller side, the housing authority has 100% interest. So on the buyer side, which is your new partnership that the housing authority is going to control, you have to structure it so it's not a related party, which means that and on the ownership, that's not a problem because the tax credit investor is going to own 99.99%. But on the financial benefits, typically the general partner would get 90% of the cash flow and the limited partner just 10. But you can't do that on these RAD transactions. You have to have the cash flow theoretically going to the tax credit investor, and the way that you wire around that is by these seller notes that the housing authority is going to take back, where the cash flow will go to pay the seller note, and by all your projections you'll show that the seller note won't get paid off in the first 15, 17, whatever years. So that's kind of the way that you work around that tax issue. Okay, so one other question is what recommendations would you give to a housing authority as to how they assemble a team to move forward on RAD transactions, other than hiring all of us?
Yeah, there you go, you're done. I think to assemble the proper team, you need to assemble it in the beginning. If a housing authority wants to either do new construction or rehabilitation, don't come up with your development plan and then start seeking out players. Get the members of your team together to develop the plan together to make sure all the goals are aligned and timelines line up. If you put together a plan and then bring in all your consultants after the fact, you may find out that you did not have all the facts or all the information, or what you want to get done can't get done, or the people you pick cannot perform in the way you've underwrote. So my number one recommendation is to assemble your team first before you do anything. The other thing I would just say, I don't think we have time to talk about it, is on rehab deals, you need to be very aware of your scope of rehab, and you need to talk to your lender and your investor about the scope of rehab. Do not plan your rehab scope based upon the RPCA. That's the HUD or the RAD physical needs assessment. The standard under the RPCA is much lower than what your LIHTC investor or lender will want. And if you plan the scope based solely on that, you will not get your deal done.
I think the other thing I would add to that as it relates to developing your team, kind of adding on to Jeff and my earlier point, is you as a housing authority or you as a development partner need to realize who you are at the end of this goal. I think that will then drive your development team. You know, if you want to be the developer, if you want to start, if you have a 5-property portfolio, you have chaps for all 5, and you want to end up being this nonprofit developer within that region, then you need to build up that expertise. You're not going to magically wake up at the end of the closing of deal 5 saying, well, I know tax credits, I can do this all by myself. So who you want to become as a public housing agency will drive then who you pick for your development team, you know, as it relates to growing with every single deal, or if you just want to be a property manager, whatever your, you know, public housing exit strategy is, that will then drive as well your development team. And I would also just, again, egg on the fact that asking other peers what they've done is a great idea. And if you have a portfolio, thinking about keeping the same team for every asset. I know we like to RFP for every single action, but you might save yourself a lot of headache and costs if you just RFP for the entire portfolio versus on a deal-by-deal basis.
Yeah, I guess I would just make sure that you assess your capacity. There are some housing authorities that have their own development arm or even have created a development entity, and they've been doing tax credit deals or bond deals and stuff over the years, and they've got significant capability, but they may not know how to put an application together to get a 9% or 4% application, so maybe you need that kind of a consultant. Picking a tax credit partner with a long history and capability of acquisition rehab. I think a lot of these things we talked about today, you know, getting up front, you know, the exit strategy, understanding what your exit tax is. Every tax credit investor calculates exit taxes as part of our approvals to even issue a letter of intent. So it's all calculated on a balance, and you might want to ask what those assumptions are to make sure that you agree with what they've done in terms of their analysis. But really, assessing your capacity, there are a lot of very talented lenders and equity providers who I think are all very capable of doing a good job for you. It's about matching personality. It's about matching expertise, who's worked with housing authorities, who has capacity to understand the RAD process. And I think if you kind of stick to that, you will do pretty well.
And my recommendation is hire me. I think once you get past the closing, you have to have somebody. I'm on a weekly call with most of these housing authorities, and I'm talking to the construction department, getting their construction schedule to see where that is. I'm looking at the investor side for their tax credit delivery expectations and see if that's still lining up. Because sometimes they start making changes as they're going along. You're like, oh, we thought we were going to start construction this month here, and they're just going to change plans, but they didn't talk to the finance guys that had a deal with the investor already. Then there's a compliance department, and a lot of these folks are learning new, the low-income housing tax credit file, tenant file that's needed, and they're used to the Section 9 file. So having somebody be that quarterback and communicate between these different departments, and all these different departments, they all do very well, but sometimes they're maybe not communicating within, or even communicating to the investors, the attorneys, the lenders externally either. So having somebody, it's their CFO or whoever it may be, but they're usually busy on the finance side of the call. So building that team and having the right folks involved that sees the big picture and knows what's going on in all facets is important.
Okay, well, I think that we are about out of time, and seeing as we are right before the cocktail hour, we don't want to be holding people over. So thank you all for joining us for this session.